And, oh wow, it's really on now. Okay. The next kind that we'll be discussing is contract grading. So in this type of ungrading, students will turn in a contract, generally at the beginning of the semester, which will state what they need to achieve in order to earn their desired course grade. So they'll generally kind of have a target grade that they're shooting for and agree on the amount of work that will be necessary to reach that grade. In this style tend to be focused on labor rather than quality, versus mastery grading, which was all about quality rather than labor. This is kind of the opposite. So in this case, higher grades tend to be the result of extra work that is intended to deepen learning. And I think writing courses were very influential in developing this style, and I think writing courses in general kind of were very important in ungrading more generally as well. Okay. So specifications grading, I think, is a newer form, but has gotten a lot of popularity recently. It combines elements of mastery learning and contract grading. So like mastery learning, assignments are graded pass-fail based on achievement of learning objectives. And then assignments are bundled into letter grade categories, allowing for both essential and supplementary learning objectives. So for example, to pass the class, maybe you have to achieve all of the essential learning objectives. And then however many supplementary learning objectives you earn on top of that could be higher grades. And then another factor that's kind of unique to specifications grading is that tokens are often used for late work or resubmissions. And most types of ungrading do include some sort of process for revising work and continuing to improve on assignments. And then the last type that we'll be specifically diving into today, unless people have questions about other types that you may have heard of, is collaborative or interview-based grading. So in this case, instructor will provide feedback, but will not give numerical or percentage-based grades on things. And then students will complete self-assessments, which often include questions about reflection and metacognition. And then students will meet with the instructor as needed to discuss their progress. Final grades are then determined by consensus between student and instructor. So I'll pause here for a moment to see if folks have clarifying questions about what ungrading is or the different types before we talk a little bit about our personal experiences with it.
What are the tokens of the previous slide?
Right, so often, as I said, ungrading tends to involve a lot of resubmitting of work or revisions. Sometimes that it can be too burdensome on the instructor if students are, if a lot of students, maybe they're all turning in a lot of things. So tokens are kind of a way to still allow for that without, while making it more sustainable for the instructor. So maybe each student gets 5 tokens at the beginning of the semester, and then that's the number of resubmissions. So they could use a token either to resubmit an assignment that they perhaps didn't pass, since it's a pass-fail grading, or they could use it to turn in something like a day late, depending on how they chose to use the token and how you set up the system. Yeah. Other questions? So a little bit about my personal experience with ungrading, and I use the collaborative/interview-based grading approach. So I do this in my organic chemistry lab for chemistry majors. And so the way it works is that students will get feedback from me on their assignments throughout the semester. And I do provide them with a kind of rubric/guideline of what kind of work I expect to see in different types of grade categories. So for example, to pass the class, I do expect them to achieve like a satisfactory formal lab report, for example. And then maybe to get an A, they would turn in like an extra polished, well-researched lab report. Right, but there isn't, I'm not giving them a lab report feedback that says like 80%. Right. And so then halfway through the semester, they complete a learning reflection and they think about what they've been learning in the class and what types of things that they've been doing that have been helpful to their learning, what might be barriers to their learning, things that they would like to do to improve their learning in the class, things that I can do to help them with their learning. And they kind of give themselves a self-assessment on how they're feeling at that time and what kind of grade they think they're earning. And then we have a conversation about that. And we talk first about their learning and how that can be supported and continue to grow throughout the semester, and any course corrections that we might need to make to improve that. And then we talk about whether their self-assessment matched up with what I feel that their work is at. And then we can kind of talk about what grade they're hoping to achieve and what kind of work they should be doing in order to achieve that. And then we meet again at the end of the semester. And again, they complete a learning reflection and they assign themselves a grade first. And then we meet and we talk about whether I felt like they self-assessed accurately, and we agree on a final grade for them for the lab. Yeah, and so students in general have liked this approach. I was worried they would find it confusing or be unsure about it, but they did seem to find that it lowered their anxiety. They felt like they could focus more on the learning and less on the grade. I do a lot of work up front to get buy-in with the students, so I talk to them about why I want to do this and what I'm hoping they'll get from it. And so I talk about after college, you don't get grades, right? But you don't have a transcript, but you still need to do your work, right, at a high level, and you need to figure out what you need to do to learn and grow and get better in your work. And I talk about my job and how every year I do self-assessments, right? And I have a sit-down meeting with my boss, and we talk about what I've been doing well and what I need to work on next year and things like that. And so when it's framed like that, they see it as an opportunity to practice something they're going to likely have to do later on, and it will help them be more successful once they're out of college and they're not getting grades anymore. And then I feel that the work that I've seen from the students in this section, both in the effort that they put in and the quality of work that they do, hasn't really changed when I switched to this approach. That being said, the students who take this majors lab section tend to be very high performing and put in a lot of effort. There's also other reasons that they really do. I work really hard to give them intrinsic reasons to care about the class and what they're doing in the class and what they're learning. And so what I would like to think is that that's the reason that they're working really hard and trying to learn this stuff, because they actually do care about learning it and do care about doing the types of work that we're doing in the class. And that, rather than the grade, is what's kind of driving them in the class. I will say also that I've seen a difference in the types of questions that I get asked. In my other lab sections that aren't graded this way, I get a lot of questions about, like, how do I answer this problem, right? Like, how do I solve this problem? What's the right answer? Those sorts of questions. And in this section, where it's ungraded, I get more questions about the chemistry, right? And their understanding and their learning, rather than about, like, the specific problem that's on the problem set. So that's kind of a brief overview of my experiences. So I'll see if anyone has questions before I turn it over to Michelle. Yeah.
Yeah. For that, I mean, the ungraded section, do you like have like a traditional like breakdown, like, you know, this patient or whatever is like 10%, and somebody else is 40%, and they're supposed to kind of assess themselves based on that? It's just kind of like,
not percentages. I do kind of have like minimums, I'd say. So like, if they want to get a B, they need to be doing at least this much in this area and at least this much in this area. But it's not really, there's no percentage. Like, they should be hitting those benchmarks in each area. But it's a little hard to describe without numbers. But I do have it on my LinkedIn page if you want to look at that. You can kind of see the guidelines that I provide to students. Yeah.
So in the lab, still in being organic chemistry, they still need to memorize. They still need to have certain, sorry, not memorize, they still need to have certain amount of pure knowledge, right? So how do you assess the
So
the actual amount of knowledge they take away from the class.
So I still give them the same worksheets and papers and assignments and assessments that I give the other sections. It's just that when I give the feedback, I'm just giving my written feedback. I'm not saying you got 8 out of 10 on this problem. I'm saying, you know, I do that with the other sections too, where I say you got 8 out of 10 on this problem, and here are the things that you missed, here are the things you got right. In this section, I'm not giving them the 8 out of 10. I'm just giving them the here's what you missed, here's what you got right.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you, so I'm curious if you find that different people have different levels of comfort or ability to reflect and then speak to you on their own behalf for their grade, and like, are there students that you feel like you have to help, because there's only 2 conversations, it sounds like, that you have to help, like, say, you know, I think you did better, you know, say you did better, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Like, how do you help students who come in with different confidence levels get to a place where they can have a conversation with you where you feel like you're coming together?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think it helps that it's one section and it's relatively small. Like the highest it can get is 16. So I'm able to develop an individual relationship with students before that first meeting. And so I think that helps with the students who struggle with self-confidence and those things, that at least like they know me and they kind of know why I'm doing this. And then again, I see that as important for those students to learn how to do that. Like that's a skill that is going to help them later on. And so, yeah, I do try to, that's part of the reason I do it. And I think it's those students who struggle with the most who will probably get the most out of it and who need it the most. But I do definitely keep that in mind, since there are grades attached to it. I can't not assign a grade. So it's not so much about like how well they self-advocate, right? I do read their reflections, and I do like take all of their work into consideration. And that's why I don't let them solely assign it. Like that's why I also have to agree. Yeah.
So do they on average get better grades than the other sections? And how do you choose into this section? Is it a giant line to get into ungraded section? How does it happen?
So it is a section for majors. So pretty much if they're a chemistry major, they choose whether to take it or not. It's opt-in. It's not required for chemistry majors. I don't know if the fact that it's ungraded makes it more or less popular than it otherwise would be, because it is already unique. The grades are higher, but also, again, it's a major section, and they're doing a lot more work than the other sections, so I tend to be a little more generous. Already, like even before it was ungraded, everyone got an A because they were doing so much more work than the other sections. So it's a little hard to say. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this a standalone lab course, or is it connected to a lecture course?
It is connected to a lecture course.
So then how do you, and that lecture course is not ungraded, how do the students feel about that, and is there any tension between an ungraded element to a course and a graded element to a course, and then one grade that comes out?
Right. So they do have a different lecture instructor. So I think they kind of see it as, right, it's lab. It's kind of like a smaller add-on course to like the main course. It's already kind of separate. You know, we try to integrate the concepts as much as possible, but it has its own syllabus. It has its own policies. And that's just kind of already how it is, whether or not you're in this special major section. So I don't think there's a lot of internal issues with that with the students, at least not that they've told me about.
Because I'm also a scientist, and so I'm just thinking a lot of times, as you said, there's some knowledge they have to sort of acquire, have some facility with, and then be able to use it. A lot of times that's relegated to the lecture.
Mm-hmm.
And the laboratory is more practical, sort of hands-on. So I could imagine there's a little bit of tension over grades as your sort of goalpost in a lecture for knowledge, and non-grades but feedback as your goalpost for the same kind of knowledge in the lab. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about that from the students, but it would be an interesting question to ask them. Yeah.
Everyone. Ooh, gosh, hold on, how to hold this. Okay, great. I'm going to be brief-ish so that we can get into small groups. I'll give you an overview of my practice. As I said, I'm in English, and so I have some similarities to Sadie's practice, but there are some differences because I think that the kinds of students who end up being drawn to the humanities obviously have some like personality and sort of intellectual differences from in terms of like predilections than our science majors. And so I started out ungrading with just an assignment in a class, and then I eventually ended up where I am now, which is in all of my courses, I have a similar structure where most of the grades, actually, Nathan, to your question, I do have percentage breakdowns in my syllabus but everything's equal. I have participation. I have some like metacognitive kind of reflection stuff I have students do as writing assignments. And I also have them do actual like kind of traditional papers. But what was really important to me in the ungrading process is that there would be a component where students would be asked to articulate their ideas to me when they were in the midst of the writing process, and then also after they had revised. Because what actually drew me to this is like, I hate grading papers. Like, I really hate it. And I hated receiving graded papers because all I would do, because I was such an anxious student, was like, go to the end, see what my grade was first, and then go back and like see if I could like venture to look at the comments. Like, it was just so tenuous. It was like, I know that like this was my perfect polished thing or my imperfect polished thing. Like, did I get away with it? Like, did I like wow them? Like, how, do they like me? Am I good enough? And so I told my students about like myself as an anxious writer and how much I pinned my self-worth on my grades. And so I wanted to be able to like get at that perfectionism for a lot of them, but then also make it more of a process and to realize that writing is always iterative. It is always about revision. It is communal. Like, the most excited I ever get about my ideas is when I'm talking about them with people rather than like submitting them to a journal. So I wanted to give students a little bit of that experience. So on the practical end of things, the way I've set it up is I scaffold my paper deadlines. I have an initial paper deadline that is pretty strict because I tell them, turn in whatever you have. Because I think there's a lot of anxiety around deadlines for students too, because they've been working themselves up to like, oh my God, like my paper's due, And so I say, if you have bullet points, if you have a good first paragraph and whatever, like make it as complete as possible. And usually I do get pretty complete drafts. There are just sometimes some students who are having, mental health issues or whatever circumstances are coming up, and then they will submit to me whatever they have. And then, but there's already a kind of grace built into the system. So I tell them I need them to turn it in as close as possible to that initial deadline, because the following week I will have in-person marathon meetings with students for about a half an hour on one day. They'll come in, I'll have them prepare, reread your paper. What did you notice? What do you see? Can you restate your thesis to me? So they're talking through their ideas, and then they will actually say, I didn't realize, like I thought on my paper, I thought that I had said this, but when I reread it, I had only said it to myself. I didn't say it in the text. So you get out of that, for me, I get better papers because the students are rereading their papers rather than just submitting them and waiting for me to tell them what they did or didn't do. As a side note, one of our colleagues, Barbara Junis-Bai, has a fantastic kind of peer review model that I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate into this, because at this point, like a lot of my feedback is like between me and the student rather than sort of put out into the community, which I think is another important way to get students to kind of think about their own writing. So I have that meeting with them, and then I give them comments. I have like a brief paragraph that I'll write up as a reflection on our meeting, but I don't give them a draft that's marked up. They're responsible for taking notes during the meeting. I will give them a summary, and then if I had any like kind of highlights or anything on an electronic draft that they gave me, I will submit that to them as well. And then they'll have a week to do edits on that. Sometimes people will come to my office hours, so there'll end up being more meetings afterwards. I also ask students, somewhat different from Sadie, I ask students during that meeting, do you want to talk in terms of grades, or do you want to talk like purely in qualitative terms? Because I know that some students have such grade anxiety knowing that there will eventually be a grade, that it is not, that they can barely hear what you're saying about their work, because in the back of their mind they're just like, does that translate to a B- or an A? You know, like how do I do? So I give them the choice, and that was a decision I came to with the help of my CTL colleagues, because I was like, I don't know how to manage this because I can just tell, but I don't want to force them to hear it in terms of grades or not, or I don't want to withhold that from them, because we still live in a kind of graded system. So I give them the choice, and a lot of them will use the rubric language that I give them, like, and I also frame the conversation as, I am your external reader. I'm going to be able to see things that you don't see. I'm also somebody who has a certain kind of expertise. So my politics in my classroom are like, I want it to be as, lateral as possible, but also like there's always a power dynamic wherein I'm going to be ultimately assigning grades. I also have expertise, and I don't want to like not act in good faith. Like, I think that it's actually a bad faith thing to be like, oh, like we're all equals here. We're not actually equals. So I think that framing myself as an external reader and somebody with expertise, like they actually want to hear my opinions on things, and they also want to understand like how they can improve. So back to structure, I kind of have a 3 deadline structure for my writing assignments. I have one mid-semester meeting where we talk about the paper and also talk about their sense of themselves, like course progress. I can encourage them to talk a little bit more in class, or ask why, or they can say, I don't want to talk in class, or whatever it may be. And then I have a final meeting at the end of the semester where we talk about the final grades. I will just kind of give a little, I don't know, I guess I'll just say a few more comments about my own process and like revision of how I do ungrading. I'm a person who, I'm Midwest adjacent, and I don't like confrontation, and I feel like I have a really hard time thinking about the kind of coming together of like the humanities ethos, which is like there isn't a certain amount of knowledge that in many classes you have to demonstrate. It's like, how was your paper? Like, was it a good and close reading of this novel? Like, were you attentive? Like, how did you speak in class? But how, the humanities like grading, I think, can be a little bit shakier anyway, because it is more subjective than the sciences. And so I think that when I first started to do ungrading, I was just like, I'll just give them whatever grade they think that they should get unless it's too low. But I had a really hard time telling students like, no, because then no, you should get a B+. Why should you get a B+? Well, for these reasons. And it was very uncomfortable to also like, I'm like, I set myself up. I have to do this. I'm telling them to their face. I would rather just like give it to them when I'm sitting in my living room and like, assigning my grades. But I think it's also been like a learning process for me as an instructor to think about like what grades do for me as a person who assigns them, like how I think about authority, these really strange gray areas where what is the difference between an A- and a B+? It's kind of made up. But like, what does it mean for a student to get? So anyway, there's a much longer conversation to have here, which we may in fact have if that is of interest to you all. But I think that for me, like ungrading is a really powerful tool to enable students to learn, to enable them to advocate for themselves, and to also to think about like these kind of moments of like conflict and disagreement and conflict small c. I mean, I've never had like I've never come to blows. It's never been close. But just like these, I think that I know in myself as somebody who is like conflict averse and also a woman and came from certain socioeconomic backgrounds that are not the same as my students, like thinking about like what does authority look like and how to reckon with those things too. I will pause there and see if there are any questions before we go to our little small group exercises, but we can certainly revisit any of these topics that either Sadie or I have brought up.
Like,
yes?
when you have those marathon conferences, do you like cancel classes a week?
No, I have them on non-class days. So it's during the day and then I, I slot out the appointments and then assign, usually students like can work on, it works out just fine. That even if they have class, from 2:30 to 4, they can go at 10 a.m. or something.
I was just thinking about your own well-being.
Oh, my well-being doesn't track here. No, it's a long day, and my colleagues have been like, Decker, why are you doing this all in one day? You could do it on 2, and I'm like, but then it's done. So there are other ways to do it, so I wouldn't necessarily say do it all in one day because it is a long day. Yeah, go ahead, Katie and Alicia.
Might have missed what happened after those meetings, so they do the revision, and
Mm-hmm.
is that the final version of their paper, or is there other iterations of this?
That's the final version, and they also turn in a reflection with it, where they assign a grade, and then I will give them. In that instance, I've also been like playing with this too. I'll usually email them with like a short feedback on like, oh, this is the improvement that I've seen on your paper. Like this is what I've assigned as your grade. If you want to talk further about this, please come to my office hours. So it's like an invitation for further discussion if they want to. Some people take me up on it and some don't. Alicia, yeah.
I missed it. There was a follow-up. Yes. How many of these assignments do you have throughout the semester?
The ones with the intensive scaffolding, just one. So I have smaller writing assignments throughout. So every week, students will either like post a discussion question or what I call a critical reflection on the reading, and then so that's kind of like their metacognitive processing of the readings, and I find that it's really good for me to see like what students are getting out of the readings, and then it also is forcing them to like pause with the readings, do a short like writing thing about it. But I have the midterm, and it's essentially like a midterm paper and then a final paper. So they can meet with me for the final paper, but I don't do the like 3 deadlines because it's essentially nothing but like meetings the entire semester if I end up doing it that way.
And do you grade the reflections, the critical reflections, or not?
That one I do more like a contract grading. So they have 5 opportunities like throughout the semester to do, it's like 10 total, and they can miss one of each. So they have like a discussion question, 4 discussion questions they have to do, 4 reflections they have to do, and they can opt to do 4 out of 5. And it's been good. I think that I've gotten good feedback about it, that it makes them pay attention to the readings more. So yeah. And it also made it much easier because then I'm not like, oh, is this a B question or an A- question? It's like, did you do it or did you not do it?
Quick logistical.
Yes.
So how many students and how long are those one-on-ones?
I have anywhere between like 16 to 18 students typically, and then the sessions are about a half an hour because what I did last spring, which took way too much time, is I had the paper meeting and then I would have a mid-semester meeting and then I did a final meeting. And so I did last spring I did a 20-minute paper meeting, and then like the next week I did a 20-minute mid-semester meeting where I would ask them about like their sense of themselves in the course and like review the 4 categories of assessment, see where you are, and then I will do the same for you. Now I just do it in 1 half-hour meeting. So like the first 15-20 minutes we'll talk about the paper, they'll talk about like the edits that they want to make, and then the last 10 minutes we'll talk about how they're doing in the class. Yeah.
And then you just said when they do their revision,
Mm-hmm.
you actually do send them feedback and a grade, and are those, you send that at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. I think based on what they had said in that meeting of whether they wanted the qualitative or the quantitative feedback, I will honor that in that final little paragraph that I email them. This is highly developed, great job, or like this is a B+, depending on which they decided that they wanted to hear from me. Mm-hmm. And I think I've started to do more and more documentation, like more and more feedback as this has gone on, because I think the first blush or the first pass of it, I really wanted to like scale back all of what I had done the first kind of traditional grading round where I would, or route, which was like so many comments, so much, you know, feedback, so much. And so I think what I did was not have quite enough documentation for myself of like, this is what I said to the student, like, this is what we discussed. And so those little emails that I send, I will like just kind of put in a master student feedback file that I have so that when it comes to those last discussions in class, or the last discussions for the semester, like, this is what we said at the you know, in this first conversation. This is the feedback that I gave you after your final paper. And here's what we have. This is what brings us to where we are now. Because I have, in these sort of like final conversations, it's typically, I don't know about you, Sadie, but I think that like the grades that we come to between me and my students are usually, you know, usually around the same grade. And so if they say, oh, I think it's like a B and I think it's a B plus, or vice versa, I will usually go with a higher grade. But I have had students sometimes be like, this was a really hard semester for me, but I worked really hard and I think I should get an A because I worked really hard and it was a hard semester for me. And so what I've come to say is like, as your external reader, like I can understand that your effort was probably immense. However, as your external reader, like I wasn't able to like see evidence of that work in the same way that you were exhibiting it. And so I'm going to say an A minus. So I feel like the external reader language has really helped me a lot because we have a sense of ourselves, but it's not always showing up in the same way. So I think we're going to turn it to you for like the next little while. Is it still me? I don't think I have anything else to say. Oh, no, it is. So I think what I think would be really great for the next, well, you can decide if you think it's great. We have some sample questions for you to talk about in, let's say, groups of 3. But you don't have to talk about these questions. If you have any responses, anything that's coming up for you, and the way that Sadie and I have responded to your questions about ungrading, we would love for you to, or if you have like specific scenarios, ideas, thoughts that you want to kind of workshop with your peers, we're going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes for you to work those out, and then we'll bring them back to the group. Okay, so go ahead. Groups of 3. Excuse me, everyone. Sorry to interrupt, but if you can finish up your thought, and then we'll all come back together. Yeah, if it's time, we're gonna ask you to share some of the challenges and thoughts that you discussed. Hi, everyone. Since we're so small, we were hoping that what we could do in this next little part of the session is to kind of use our collective brilliance to think through the challenges and the questions. I mean, Sadie and I have some experience, but I would love to know what your experiences are. Are you curious? Are you trying some stuff out? Like, what challenges have you encountered? What sort of things did you discuss? If you were just thinking about these questions in the abstract, or if you were bringing your personal experience, we'd love to like work on these things together. Would anyone be willing to start us out?
I think for the first question, I mean, yes and no. I think you can do both. I mean, it depends on the individual. I mean, like students are really invested in the course. They're going to think more about what they're doing. And then you're going to ask students, maybe it's like an entry level course and they're just taking it for a GED or not really care and see this as an easy way to get by. So I think it can do both. I think I got to figure out how to like kind of sell it to everybody. They want to have some kind of buy-in, so that more people are, putting forth good effort rather than just kind of seeing this as an easy way to get a grade.
Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I'm a librarian, so take this from an outside, haven't taught a course in a long time. I don't know that I see how alternative assessment would reduce the rigor of a class if done thoughtfully, just because I feel like, hypothetically imagining what this would look like I end up with students who get crap grades when they don't, like the work is still the work, right? Whether or not I'm assigning a number or whether I'm having a conversation. I mean, I guess I do see how contract grading could somehow in theory reduce the rigor, but at the same time, I would only be using contract grading in situations where I want that work done and the quality is not the most important thing in that moment, right? I'm not doing contract grading for my papers, I'm doing it for my, weekly reflection, engagement type work. So, I would love to hear you speak more on like a version of this where like they would get an easy grade, because while I think it would be more difficult for the instructor in all scenarios, whether they're getting high grades or low grades, I still don't see, I don't see a student getting an artificial A out of alternative assessment.
Yeah, so I mean, the first time I did this, I just did it for a paper.
Sure.
And I had students turn in a short paper, and then I gave them comments on it, and I recorded the grade on my own, and then I gave them the comments, and they're supposed to write a reflection paper and give themselves a grade. And so we did that, and then I think they realized at that point that, that they could decide what their own grade was. And like, I think what Michelle was saying, like, I only adjusted their grade if I thought their grade was too low. If it was high, I just let them do it. And then we did it a second time, and the grades shot up a ton based on what they were doing. And then at the end, I had them reflect on the whole ungrading process. And one student explicitly wrote that she gave herself a higher grade than she thinks she deserved, and she doesn't think anybody would do opposite than that.
Interesting. And like I think the first time I would probably do that, and then I think like, do you think, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think you would be able to let them get away with that again? Because that feels like the kind of thing that would happen when I am like, okay, right, I'm trying to be equitable, and I'm trying to honor their own experience of their experience, and so I'm only going to help bring them up. But that would be me being like, okay, that was because I was afraid, or because I, hadn't gone through the experience yet, and then I would try and combat that. So that almost feels like I'm not trying to speak in a weird way here, but almost like a rifting mistake. But again, not a teacher. So tell me if I'm also being like I'm misinterpreting that kind of.
No, I think it was the first time I did it, and I didn't foresee all the problems. The other thing I didn't think about is that when I write like comments, like students are going to interpret that in the whole experience with dealing with instructor comments and like kind of going through them and figuring out what they mean. Versus I had one student who I gave her a bunch of comments. I thought her paper was really engaging. I wrote like things like, well, I can unpack this more, etc. And she thought just because she had a bunch of ink on the paper that it meant she did a poor job, and so she graded herself low. So it was it was kind of all over the place. But then I think once the students realized that they didn't really have to put a lot of effort in, that's where I think rigor can go down. I mean, they could put effort in, but when they decide their own grade, I mean, I got to tell that student who explicitly told me that she gave herself a higher grade than she thought she deserved.
Yeah, I think that story was fascinating to me about the student who's homework writing and assumed it was bad work. I think that there's a couple of things. I can imagine that the way in which students will learn a way of being a system. So the first time you do anything, it's just a learning exercise, right? And then you have to change it around. Whether game the system or not understand the system, right, is what's happening. I feel like it's got to be iterative, like it's never just going to work perfectly the first time. I also think that why the students are in the classroom make a big difference. So I've got a lot of pre-meds. Who wants to apply to medical school is going to choose a B? Like none of them are going to do that. And you have to kind of just know that and build that into your system. At the same time, when you've got students who are already seniors in a major, they already want to put the work in versus their sophomores and this is a non-majors course. So it demands so much on who the student is, what the course is, what type of assessment you're doing. I can imagine the rigor would go up again.
That actually brings me to a question I kind of have for Sadie in terms of if it was sustainable, would this be something you'd be interested in doing for the broader set of organic chemistry labs, or do you feel like there's something purposeful and ideal about doing it with majors?
So I would not do the interview based collaborative based grading with all of the sections. Again, I think the context really matters, right? And so it works really, really well for my majors lab context. What I would like to do, and I'm just working out still how to do it, is apply a specifications grading type alternative assessments to the rest of the lab sections, because I think for that context, it will work, it'll work better for a variety of reasons. I think there's the sustainability aspect. I think that is really big. There's also, like I mentioned, I like to think that the students in the majors lab have a lot of intrinsic motivation to be there, and I don't think that's necessarily true of the other sections, not because of the students necessarily, but because of the content and the way that it's taught. It's just not quite as engaging, I think, as the major section, and so I do think it's just the context is different, and so I do still feel like the principles of ungrading really apply, and I want to give the students more ownership and agency over their grades, and feel like the process is more equitable and transparent, but I don't think the collaborative grading is right for that setting.
Can I jump in too? About the rigor question. The rigor question is a big one for me. I think that like from a sort of 10,000 foot view, and I think even on Twitter when people would like pile on professors who talk about ungrading, it's like, oh my God, like, higher education has lost its sense of, standards and value, and like here we are just giving students whatever they want. And I think speaking to your experience, Nathan, and even to your question, Katie, about like the different iterations of ungrading, when I did do it the first time, I did the same thing as you, Nathan. But I also I wonder about like the in-person conversation component about giving feedback, because for me, that was the place wherein I could say, this was outstanding, however, you need to take a really close look at this part of your paper. Like because I feel like so much of the communication of like standards or the harshness is either like, students would interpret like a lot of writing as being negative if they were like, oh my God, this is bad because he had so much to say about it. But it's like, no, I'm like excited. This is amazing. Like, please say more about this. But that's lost in the like written component. But but I think also, like, I did have a element of like of fear in the question of like equity. Like, equity is a huge, important kind of, I don't want to say it's a bland term almost that's lost its meaning, because I think that like equity, at least as the way that it's taught, it's not about being, it's equitable. So I have the ability in my classrooms to try to understand like how to be equitable and to kind of like address students where they are, and that's going to be different for each student. A student who had a boarding school education coming into my class is going to need a different set of, a different amount, a different kind of help and encouragement than a student who's a first-gen student. And so I think that like rigor is going to also be a sort of like floating signifier, just as equitable is going to be a floating signifier. So I think where I am in my ungrading practice, I now understand that some students who would game the system, right, need that corrective. They need the outside reader perspective. They need somebody from the outside to say, I think that this is, I see what you're doing, not like I see what you're doing here, but like, I see your work, and this is the rubric. I also like hated rubrics before, but now I see the helpfulness to give a different set of vocabulary around grades and around work, or assessment, I guess I should say. But to different students, I can say, like, this is excellent work and you're undervaluing yourself, or this is good work and you're overvaluing yourself, right? Or you're overestimating how much your own struggle is translating to something that someone else can receive on the page. So I think I don't have a perfect system, but I think that like the place where I have come now is there's some like combination of like written feedback, conversation, and like that kind of end of semester coming together of like, this is my self-assessment. I, the student, am assessing myself this way. And then I, as the instructor, don't have to feel, I don't know, that I don't have the right or I don't have the perspective. Like what I'm giving them is perspective because they're like 18 or 19 years old. They have a sense of themselves, but they're not like, they don't have a sense of the field. Like they don't know what they're doing in a kind of broad historical sense. And so I think that I'm giving them perspective on their own work, and that's something that they just can't have. Yeah.
I have a question, which is, so how do you go about then ungrading in the context of content-based class? So specifically, I'm going to teach paleoclimate, and it's going to be facts and facts and facts and calculations and facts again. So there is very little room for discussion because it's not even climate change, it's paleoclimate. So what do we know about past climate? So how do you, and obviously I'm going to grade, so it has to be graded because, assignments, I know from experience that assignments are hard, and the only thing which motivates them to do the hard assignment is a grade. If I don't grade it, then they come to me and say, we don't know how to do it, can you please show us? So there has to be, a carrot at the end that will motivate them to go through the hardness. But how would you go about assessing, a fully content-based class then? And it's not even skills.
Sure.
It's not like they will learn a little bit of skills, but the skills already, they have to come with certain skills, calculations and ability to, set up equations, all the, how do you go about it?
Yeah, so I think the most common style that I see applied to that kind of class is specifications grading because it has the different learning objectives that are very, very closely tied to the system. So with the content, you can specify like a subset of the content as your essential learning objectives, right? And maybe additional things would be supplemental, and then that way you can bundle it into the letter grades. So there's an entire book on how to do that. It's by Linda Nilsson that I strongly recommend, but I'd say that's the most common way to do it. And it's still, so some people will say that it's not ungrading and that it doesn't deserve the term ungrading because it's not transformative enough. And then other people say that it's like the one true equitable way, and that there's too many equity concerns with the other ways. So that like there's certainly differing opinions in the ungrading community about it, but from people who teach content heavy classes, I will say that's the kind that I've seen used most commonly.
It's just really kind of will be kind of like really twisting my brain to find out what is, you know, bare minimum, what is, yeah. But I just have to figure it out.
One thing I want to say, I'm sure in addition to facts, there's some concepts and some application of facts and concepts if you want to.
Of course, there are concepts,
Right.
yeah.
One thing that all alternative assessments that we talk about have this idea of less of the one and done mentality and much more of a growth mentality. So one thing I think you could easily add to any course is this idea of you don't have to know all these facts on this day at this time in this format, and if you don't, you get a C, and if you do, you get an A, and that's that, and a day, wash your hands of it. So giving students opportunities to show you in other ways or other times that they can acquire these facts, that they can use them in some way, is another way to build into your course a little bit more of an alternative assessment feel, right? Because it is true, everybody just doesn't, like, on the day when they're supposed to have a sit-down exam, they may not be at their best for whatever reason.
Yeah, I actually don't want to give exams in this class, A, because I'm teaching it first time, so I'm nervous myself, and B, because I feel like, there are so many facts which I'm looking at right now that it's unfair of me to test them in form of the exams. I'm just looking for alternative ways to assess, which is a lot to think about in the next 4 days.
We have about 7 minutes left, and we have like one little activity or a reflection left. But any like pressing issues, questions, thoughts that you wanted to bring to the group, philosophical objections. The last little thing that we were hoping for you to do. We have scenarios here. We didn't get to those, but we actually talked about them a little bit. But we will have these slides available to you if you want to look at them. But we just wanted you to take a minute or two to jot down 2 or 3 practices or ideals you want to ground your ungrading practice this semester. Because I feel like, as was evidenced perhaps in this conversation, like the process itself is ever unfolding. But for me, I feel like it's important to come back to like, what is why am I doing this? Like, what is your like ideal, your kind of ethic of ungrading? So maybe take a minute and like write down a mini, I don't want to say mini manifesto, that's too long, but like maybe one ethic or like one principle and one practice that you want to try to incorporate this semester or to have guide you this semester in ungrading practice. right. Would anybody be willing to share theirs? We will create a document to our collective ungrading core principles or practices for the semester that you either want to give a try or you want to have as a sort of North Star if you're not going to try it this semester for the next semester.
Student peer reviews for me. I never tried that.
Okay, great. It's a great practice, student peer reviews.
And I was thinking about these student peer reviews on group presentations. Yeah, I don't know. Just thought about it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nathan.
So I guess the principle would be like students learn more from reflecting on their work and thinking about how they can improve it, revise. And then for that, so I have to do this like 5 reading responses, I guess I call it, where we have them, they have to quote the text and then analyze it. And then I thought like it would be 5 in the semester, but maybe after like 3, they have to submit a reflection to me in which they aggregate comments I gave them to kind of figure out what kind of things they generally improve on.
Oh, nice. So like a kind of reflection on your feedback. Yeah, interesting.
Yes, mine is more general. So I would like to motivate self-assessment so that students would appreciate the depths of their, sorry, it's going to sound a bit awful. So appreciate the depths of their ignorance in terms of how complex the climate system is and how much is there to learn. And by self-assessment, I hope that they will just reflect on how much is still, with how much will be left, outside of the class. That they will, it will hopefully foster their, desire to learn more about that. So, and do it through self-assessment rather than me saying, at the end of the class, we still know nothing. Congratulations, you learned nothing. But how little they learn so that they will keep, hopefully, looking into this field. I mean, I know
No, that sounds great. I feel like at the end of every semester, I do the same. I feel like that's a great outcome, actually. I feel like at the end of every semester, I'm like, well, I feel like we covered this much, and hopefully you have a sense of like the kinds of questions that you want to ask rather than the depth of things that you know. Yes. Of course. That's a great list. Any final comments, contributions, questions? Obviously, Sadie and I are available, so we're happy now or throughout the semester if anyone is trying something out to have further conversations, to give feedback on assignment ideas, alternative assessment ideas. We're here for you. But thank you so much for coming and being game. But final thoughts, final word? You really just great. Oh my God, it's the worst. Just the heaviness. I am not a pleasant person to be around if I have to. And then I always lie, and I'm like, I'm really looking forward to reading your papers. I'm like, that's not true. Why am I lying to them? Why am I lying? This is actually being recorded. I love reading the papers.